Okay guys, so we're going to go over chapter 18 here, just do a really quick rundown of it, so kind of a short, condensed, hopefully half-hour version of this. So we'll get right into it here. So chapter 18 is leases. In your book, this is on page 365. So we'll first start with here, in leases, there's a landlord-tenant relationship. The landlord we call the lessor, and the tenant we call the lessee. And if you guys remember from in class, I always talk about that or versus e concept. The best way to remember this, if the word ends in or we say it gives the base of word. We say if the word ends in double e, we say it receives the base of word. So the lessor is the party who gives the lease, and the lessee, the party who receives the lease. So for starters, if they were to ask you on the test, like, which of the following best describes the lessor, and which of the following best describes the lessee, the lessor, the party who gives the lease, that is the landlord, and the lessee, the party who receives the lease, that is the tenant. Next here, we're going to get into, on the top left of 365, talks about a reversionary interest. And what we need to know about that is that is what best describes the landlord's interest in any of their leasehold estates. What does that mean? That means when that lease comes to an end, the property reverts back to the landlord's possession. So for example, if we just signed a lease for a year with a tenant, and a year comes up, and that tenant does not renew, that property then comes back to me as a landlord. I can do whatever I want with it. I can re-rent it, I can move into it myself, I can do whatever I want to do with it. But this term here is called a reversionary interest. And commonly what they'll ask in the test is they'll say, which of the following best describes the landlord's interest in any of their leasehold estates? That's a reversionary interest. So we'll get this up here to begin with. So again, it's called a reversionary interest. And this best describes the landlord's interest in any of their leasehold estates. So again, this reversionary interest, we say it best describes the landlord's interest in any of their leasehold estates. And, basically what this simply means, that when the lease comes to an end, the property is going to revert back to the landlord's possession. Simple as that. So now, what we're going to get into is we're going to talk about really four main different types of leases. We're going to talk about the estate for years, the periodic tenancy, the tenancy at will, and the tenancy at sufferance. So the first one that we're going to start off with here is the estate for years. It's a phrase that confuses a lot of people because people hear the term for years and they think that that must be for a certain number of years. But actually a tenancy for years is simply just a lease for a definite period of time. This could be a shore rental down the shore with your family for 2 weeks. Any lease in which is going to have a definite start date and a definite end date, we're going to call that an estate for years. So this could be a lease for 3 days, for 3 weeks, for 3 months, but if you have a start date and an end date, we say that is an estate for years. So we'll put this up here, and just so you guys know on the test, they can use the words estate and tenancy interchangeably when they're talking about leases. So this type of lease right here, I'm calling it an estate for years. They could also, if they want to, call it a tenancy for years. So just keep that in mind when they're talking about leases. The words estate and tenancy can be used interchangeably. So the first one here, number one, is the estate for years. And this would be any lease for a definite period of time. So again, number one here, the estate for years is simply just any lease that is for a definite period of time. So simple as that. So again, number one, the estate for years, any lease for a definite period of time. It's not like the landlord or tenant has to give 30 days notice prior to cancellation. It's already known up front when that's going to be done. So like I don't have to remind the tenant like, hey, as a reminder, your lease ends on March 1st. It's already written up front that it ends on March 1st. So the second one that we're going to talk about here is the periodic estate. So number two, the periodic estate. And this here is any lease from period to period. This could be week to week, month to month, year to year, so on and so forth. Again, it's any lease from period to period. Probably the two main things I would take away from this is the month to month and year to year. So for a month to month periodic tenancy, it's going to be 30 days notice to cancel a lease or raise rent. And for the year to year, it's going to be 90 days notice to cancel a lease or raise rent. Hypothetically, a month-to-month periodic tenancy will go on forever until landlord or tenant gives 30 days notice to cancel. There's no end date listed up front. You sign it on a month-to-month basis, and upon you giving 30 days notice, you can get out of there. So again, the two that we have to probably know about is a month-to-month and year-to-year. So for a month-to-month periodic tenancy, it's going to be 30 days notice to cancel lease or raise rent. And for the year-to-year, 90 days notice to cancel lease or raise rent. So again, for the month-to-month, this will be 30 days notice to cancel lease or raise rent. And for the year-to-year, it's going to be 90 days notice. Same thing, to cancel lease or raise rent. So again, the month-to-month is 30 days notice. The year-to-year is going to be 90 days notice here. So those are the main differences between those two. And then the third one here we go over is a tenancy at will. Now, a tenancy at will is a very unique arrangement. And what makes a tenancy at will extremely unique is the fact that you are basically just renting the property to the tenant at the will of the landlord. And what does that exactly mean? What does a tenancy at will mean? Well, that means that if I rent you the property under a tenancy at will, there's no formal arrangement. I'm just saying you could stay here, basically. So to give you an example where this might occur, let's say your brother gets divorced and he needs somewhere to live, and you happen to have a small apartment above your garage, and you tell your brother, hey, listen, shack up above the garage, just live there, give me $500 a month. He's your brother, so you don't have him sign anything, he's just going to pay you $500 a month. That might be a tenancy at will. Now, what also is unique about this tenancy at will, and probably most important to know for the test, is if they were to ask you what type of lease would end when the property is sold, it's a tenancy at will. Besides that, we always say that all leases are going to be binding on the new owner. So if I buy a property, there's currently tenants in place, I can't knock on the door and say, hey, clean up your bags and get out of here. Doesn't work that way. Again, I have to recognize that lease and I have to respect that lease. So we would say that typically all leases are going to be binding on the new owner of property, except for this tenancy at will. Again, because a tenancy at will is an informal arrangement, there's really been nothing put in place. It can end when the property is transferred. So if you know one thing for the tenancy at will, what I would just write down if I were you, I'd write down that a tenancy at will can be terminated when the property is transferred, whereas the other types of leases, they cannot. The other types of leases we say are binding the new owner unless you come up with some sort of agreement to get them out. Maybe you offer them like we call cash for keys, for example, something like that. But the third one, which is probably more important, it's listed as number 4 in your book. That's a tenancy at sufferance. And when is that created? A tenancy at sufferance is created when you have a holdover tenant. So if I sign a lease with John Smith as a tenant and his lease was from October 1st, 2017 to October 1st, 2018. Well, when October 1st, 2018 rolls around and his lease comes to an end, and he's told me he has no plans on renewing, he's supposed to be out on October 1st. He doesn't move out. If he doesn't move out, we have a problem here. We have a holdover tenant. Because I might have had rented that out to somebody else, pre-leased. And they might be looking to come in on, let's say, October 5th. Well, my current tenant's not out. We don't have self-help evictions in New Jersey. We need to go through the whole formal eviction process, and that could take a long time. So a tenancy at sufferance, this is created when you have a holdover tenant. So number 1, when is this created? Again, it's called a tenancy at sufferance. So number 1, it's created when you have a holdover tenancy. Again, this here is created when you have a holdover tenancy. So again, a tenancy at sufferance, simply put, it's created when you have a holdover tenancy. So that's number 1. Number 2, sometimes you have a holdover tenant, not for like a bad reason, but just because the landlord and tenant never got together to formally sign a new lease. Now, if the landlord and tenant never got together to formally sign a new lease, but they have both verbally agreed they're going to renew this, when October 1st rolls around and we don't have a new lease in place, but I as a tenant just send him my normal rent check, if the landlord accepts my rent check, it creates an automatic month-to-month periodic tenancy under the same terms as the prior lease. So again, to reiterate that, if a holdover tenant, which would normally create a tenancy at sufferance, sends in their normal rent check, and the landlord then accepts that, that creates an automatic month-to-month periodic tenancy under the same exact terms as the prior lease. So I'd certainly write that down. So again, if a holdover tenant sends in a normal rent check and landlord then accepts it, creates an automatic month-to-month periodic tenancy under the same terms as the prior lease. Now, let's give an example of the opposite. Let's say hypothetically that the tenant does not move out and it's an egregious situation. You know, they were supposed to be moving out and they didn't move out. How do I get them out of there? I have to evict them. And there's two types of eviction. You have eviction when the landlord tries to move the tenant, and we have eviction when the tenant tries to break the lease early with the landlord. What we're going to talk about here is that when you as the landlord try to remove the tenant, how does that work? What is that called? That's called actual eviction. And we'll go over that process now. So if we have a tenancy at Sufferance, we want to truly get them out of there, the process we call actual eviction. An actual eviction, again, that is when the landlord seeks to remove the tenant, so write that down. That's when the landlord seeks to remove the tenant. It's a three-step process. I'll write these three steps up here. The first step is you serve them with a notice to quit. I guess the best way to put that is you asking them nicely to leave. And as you would imagine, that usually doesn't work. Number two, you start, going the legal route. You file for what's called a judgment of possession, which is, formally starting the eviction process. And if that still doesn't cause them to take action, last but not least, you take them to court and you file for what's called a warrant for removal. And if the courts issue that, then somebody from the sheriff's department will accompany you to the property, allow you to gain access, take their possessions out, change the locks, and now you have the property back. So the third step, the final step in this, if it gets to that point, is the warrant for removal. So number 3 here, the warrant for removal. So again, number 3 here, the warrant for removal. And those are the 4 steps in the actual eviction process, which would be, if you have a holder or tenant, you want to get them out of there, you try to evict them. The process we call an actual eviction process. So turn the page here, go to page 366. And on 366 here next, we talk about the types of ground leases and commercial leases. So we're going to get into that. So before we do that, we'll take some time to erase this board to get the new stuff up here. All right, so we'll first start with the ground lease here. If you ever heard somebody saying they're buying property on leased land, more than likely a ground lease. So what a ground lease is, you're essentially buying like a long-term lease basically. So a ground lease, the best way that you guys will know that it's a ground lease on the test, it's a lease for a very long period of time. This could be 50, 75, 100 years. Again, just a lease for a very, very, very long period of time. And under a ground lease, the tenant's going to be allowed to make any improvements or additions they would like to the property. So they can put additions on, they can update the kitchen, let's say, if it's residential. They can, paint the place, they can resize the place, put an addition on, do all those types of things. So under a ground lease, again, it is a lease for a very long period of time. It could be 50, 75, 100 years. So if they ask you which of the following best describes a lease of land for a long period of time, in which a tenant can make any improvements or additions they would like to. But again, those improvements and additions, they belong to the landlord at conclusion of term. We call that a ground lease. And I'll write this up here for you. So again, it's called a ground lease. This would be a lease for a very long period. And again, examples might be 50, 75, 100 years. And again, what we also will note up here, the tenant can make any improvements or additions they would like to the property. Those just belong to the landlord at conclusion of term. So again, the tenant can make any improvements or additions they would like to the property. But those belong to landlord at conclusion of term. So again, but those would belong to the landlord at the conclusion of the term. So again, the tenant can make any improvements or additions they would like to. These here would just belong to landlord at conclusion of term. Now in this ground lease, let's say, for example, somebody was paying something like this on a monthly basis. Well, If you sign a 100-year ground lease, the rents 100 years ago aren't the same as they are today. So you have to find ways to make these go up over time. So there's two different clauses they might throw in here, called either a step-up or a graduated clause. So the step-up clause would call for predetermined rent increases and just increases only. And the graduated clause, that will call for predetermined rent increases or decreases. As with the graduated clause, the rent is tied to some sort of index, which could cause rent to go either up or down. So maybe the rent's tied to the consumer price index, which could cause rent, if that index goes up, whatever index it's tied to, rent goes up by that amount, goes down, rent might go down by that amount. So those are the two different clauses you might find in here, and I'll write those up here. You can call a step-up clause. And this here calls for predetermined rent increases only. Hopefully you can read my handwriting. Then we have the graduated clause, and that calls for predetermined rent increases or decreases. How? With the graduated clause, rent is tied to an index, which could cause rent to go up or down. So with the graduated clause, rent is tied to index, which could cause rent to go up or down. So again, rent is tied to an index, which could cause the rent to go either up or down. That's the difference there. So that is the ground lease, the step up, the graduated. So those are the basics on that. And what we're going to move on to next here is on the bottom left of page 366. Start talking about the commercial leases. The first one that we're going to talk about here is a net lease. Now, majority of the test, large majority of the test is based on residential. So this is, a small part of the commercial. So for a net lease, the way this works, if you have a net lease, you as a tenant, you're not only paying your rent, but you're paying all the expenses that are associated with the building, all the operating expenses. So you might be paying rent, maintenance, utilities, property taxes, snow removal, landscaping, all that kind of stuff. But very commonly they'll ask you, what does a tenant not pay under a net lease? A tenant does not pay the owner's mortgage. So again, a tenant does not pay the owner's mortgage, but besides that, they're paying rent plus all the expense of the building. So, and I'll note that up here. So again, this is for a net lease, number one here. So for a net lease, the tenant pays rent plus all costs associated with the building. Now, specifically note here, the one thing the tenant does not pay, the tenant does not pay the owner's mortgage. So if they were to ask you, what does the tenant not pay? The tenant does not pay the owner's mortgage. So number two here, the tenant does not pay owner's mortgage. So again, the tenant does not pay the owner's mortgage. Next one here is a gross lease. Under a gross lease, it's kind of the opposite of this. Under a gross lease, the tenant pays one flat amount, and then the landlord pays for everything. So the tenant pays one flat amount of rent, and then landlord pays for the heating, the cooling, the property taxes, snow removal, landscaping, utilities, all that kind of stuff. So kind of the opposite of the net lease. So with a gross lease, they could say something like, what type of commercial lease does the tenant pay one flat amount, and landlord pays for all the operating expenses? That's a gross lease. Again, for a gross lease, number two here, the tenant pays one flat amount and landlord pays for operating expenses. So again, for the gross lease, tenant pays one flat amount and the landlord would pay for the operating expenses. And then towards the top right here at 366, you see me looking down and looking at the book here. Top right here at 366, that's a percentage lease. So in regards to the percentage lease, if you were to find these, and I'm not saying you're always going to find these, like if you go into a shopping mall, everything's going to be percentage lease. More often than not, it's probably not going to be. But if you were to find a percentage lease, where you would find one in a shopping mall. So typically, whenever they ask about this in the test, you'll always see the word kind of shopping mall associated with it. And the way a percentage lease works is that you as a tenant, you're not only paying rent, but you're paying a percentage of your gross sales, your gross receipts to the landlord. The landlord's also going to have this thing called a recapture clause in there that says, like, if you don't meet a set monthly minimum in gross receipts, they can take that property back from you because they're not making as much money as they want to. They were hoping you would perform better so that they can, kind of reap the rewards of your performance too. And the mall would as a whole, let's say, in a mall, because the more people you bring into the mall, the better all the rest of the businesses do, quite frankly. So this here, again, is called a percentage lease. And again, the way that this works, the tenant pays rent plus a percentage of their gross sales, and that's how it works. So again, typically found in a shopping mall, make sure you write down shopping mall with this, and the tenant pays rent plus a percentage of their gross sales. So again, this is called a percentage lease. So number 3 here, a percentage lease. So tenant pays rent plus a percentage of gross sales. And again, in this lease, you have that recapture clause, and what that states that if you don't meet a set monthly minimum gross receipts, landlord can take the property back. Again, in this, you have that recapture clause. What that states is if the tenant does not meet a set monthly minimum gross receipts, landlord may take the property back. So again, the recapture clause, what this states here, if the tenant does not meet a set monthly minimum in gross receipts, the landlord can then take the property back. So that is the recapture clause here. So, and those are the basics really for the percentage lease. And next here, if you guys go to the right side of page 367, it starts talking about, different ways you could terminate a lease. And a lot of these are common sense. Like the first one says expiration of term. If we have an estate for years, for 1 year, after 1 year, expiration of term, lease would come to an end. Simple as that. 2, surrender. 2 parties opt, let's just go our separate ways. It's like a mutual agreement. Surrender would be a mutual agreement. So let's say I'm a tenant, I lived somewhere for 5 years, and I just renewed my lease for another year, and all of a sudden I get a job transfer from New Jersey to California. So obviously I don't need this place anymore. So I tell my landlord, listen, just got a job transfer from New Jersey to California. By any chance, could I get out of my lease early? And landlord says, you know what, you've been a great tenant. You've never given me many problems. If you just give me 2 months to re-rent this place, I'll let you out early. Sure, we agree on that. That's surrender. We mutually agree to go our separate ways. 3, breach of conditions. So there's all different conditions in a lease. Like one of the conditions might say no pets. And it's found out you're breeding dogs there. You could get out because of breach of conditions. 4, we talked about actual eviction already. But on the bottom right here, what we're going to talk about for below that on the bottom right of 367 is constructive eviction. What is that? That's when the tenant seeks to break their lease early with the landlord due to the property being in unlivable condition. Now, unlivable is a very subjective term. Unlivable for some is not unlivable for others, but there's a process to this. Like if I think the property is unlivable, I got to let the landlord know. I got to give them an opportunity to fix it. If they don't fix it within a reasonable period of time, I'm allowed to vacate and end my lease early, legally. But I must vacate while the problem currently exists. So we're going to talk about that now. So this here is called constructive eviction. And I would say the first thing to write down, it is when the tenant seeks to break the lease early with the landlord due to the property being in unlivable condition. So I'll write that up here. So again, we call this constructive eviction. This here is when the tenant seeks to break the lease early due to property being in unlivable condition. So again, constructive eviction, That is when the tenant seeks to break the lease early due to the property being in unlivable condition. So that is constructive eviction. And this here, again, is a three-step process. The first step, the tenant must notify the landlord of the issue. The first step here, number one, the tenant must notify landlord of the issue. After notifying them of the issue, the tenant must then give the landlord a reasonable period of time to fix the issue. And again, as I said, a reasonable period of time is very subjective, but, you know, that would be something that would have to be played out in court. But number two, the tenant must then give the landlord a reasonable period of time to fix the issue. So number two, tenant must give landlord reasonable time to fix the issue. So again, number two, tenant must give the landlord a reasonable period of time to fix the issue. And number three, if the landlord has not fixed this issue within a reasonable period of time, the tenant must vacate while the problem currently exists. You cannot claim constructive eviction if you were to vacate after the problem is fixed. Because if you're just boiling a week later because it was fixed too late, well, too bad, it was fixed already. You must vacate while the problem currently exists. So number three here, you must vacate while the problem currently exists. So again, number three, you would have to vacate while the problem currently exists. Now, here's the thing with this. Let's say you really like this place, you love the location, you don't want to leave, like this thing needs to be fixed. I let my landlord know, I gave them time to fix it, they still haven't fixed it. There's an alternative to number three here, and that's called repair and deduct, which means simply what it sounds like. Like if the issue to fix, let's say my rent is $2,000 a month, and the repair is going to cost me, let's say, $800. What I do is after I notify them of the issue, give them time to fix it, I can then hire somebody to fix it. I pay a guy $800 to fix this leak, let's say, and my rent's $2,000 a month. Well, when it comes time to pay rent now, I'm going to send in a receipt for $800 plus a rent check for $1,200 because I'm seeking repair and deduct in that case. So, but you can only do repair and deduct after steps 1 and 2 have occurred. You can't just do that off the bat. So that's the difference there. So let's turn the page here, go to page 368. Talk about things like prior right. So for example, if a bank forecloses on a house due to their prior right in the property, that bank could actually kick the tenant out, but the reverse isn't true. We won't spend too much time on that. Destruction of premises, number 6 there. So if, let's say, the property burns down, can I still tell my tenant, hey, I don't care that it burned down, you still got to pay me rent? No, can't do that, obviously. And then abandonment. Like if your tenant just goes on like vacation, for example, that's not abandonment. Abandonment would be like if I go there after they haven't paid rent, their phone's shut off, and I look at the window and everything's gone. I call somebody from the police department, they come out and they accompany me to the property, draw up a police report showing clear showing of abandonment. Even if there's like a year left on the lease, that lease comes to an end, we could sue them, for like lost rent and breach of contract and things like that, but that's something that would be played out in court. All right, so next here we're going to talk about is on the right side of this page here, 368, sublease versus assignment of lease. The first thing that not a lot of people know is that every single lease is capable of being assigned or subleased. Every single lease can be assigned or subleased unless specifically mentioned otherwise. A lot of people think the opposite is true. A lot of people think that leases can only be assigned or subleased if it's specifically mentioned that they can. The opposite is true. The opposite being that every single lease is capable of being assigned or subleased unless specifically mentioned otherwise. So that's the first thing to write down up here, then we'll go over these two. But again, the first thing to write down is that all leases can be assigned or subleased unless specifically mentioned otherwise. So number 1, all leases may be assigned or subleased unless specifically mentioned otherwise. So again, number 1, all leases may be assigned or subleased unless specifically mentioned otherwise. And what's the difference between assignment versus sublease? Well, if I assign my lease off to you, I'm assigning you the entire remaining term. If I'm subleasing it to you, I'm transferring a portion of the remaining term. So if I have a lease from October 1st, 2018 to October 1st, 2019, let's say for the first 3 months I'm going to be away. I could sublease it to you for the first 3 months of my lease, then come back and take it back over. If I assign it off to you, let's say after 6 months, because I'm getting a job transfer across the country, I'm then assigning it to you. A sublease is for a portion of the remaining term. The assignment is for the entire remaining term. The difference here is, again, a sublease that is for a portion of remaining term, and an assignment of lease is for the entire remaining term. So again, a sublease for a portion of the remaining term, and the assignment would be for the entire remaining term. And that's the main difference there. And then we get on to page 369 here, where we start talking about security deposits. And there's really only a couple things to know for each, and when I say each, I mean residential versus commercial security. So for residential security, the maximum that they can charge you is 1.5 months rent. So if my rent's $1,000 a month, the most they could charge me is $1,500. So number one for residential, the maximum is 1.5 months rent. So again, this is for security deposits. So for residential, the max they can charge me is 1.5 months rent. For commercial, the max they can charge me, there is no max. There's no max on commercial security. And then also for security, we talk about who is the property of. My residential security deposit is my property as a tenant, which means any interest gained on that is paid out to me. I got to know where the deposit is being kept, all that kind of stuff. Commercial, there's less regulation. So in commercial, the security is actually the property of the landlord, so to say. Typically, I would say probably err on remembering residential for sure. So for residential, the max you can charge is 1.5 months rent, and the security is going to be the property of the tenant, which means that, again, if there's any interest gained on that, it is paid out to the tenant. Tenant has to be notified where the deposit is being kept, has to be notified when the lease comes to an end, why any money is being held back, all that kind of stuff. So again, that's the main difference there between commercial versus residential security. So we're going to finish up here for chapter 18. And if you guys have any questions, certainly feel free to reach out to me. So again, this was chapter 18, leases.